Hello, and welcome to the Scope of Things podcast, a no-nonsense look at the promise and problems of clinical research based on a sweep of the latest news and emerging trends in the field and what I think is worthy of your 30 or so minutes of time. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News, which means I spend a lot of time with my ear to the ground on your behalf and a lot of hours every week speaking to top experts from around the world. Please consider making this your trusted go-to channel for staying current on things that matter, whether they give us hope or cause for pause. In another 5 minutes or so, I'll be speaking with two of the chief leaders with uncommon cures, CEO Marshall Summar, MD, and CMO Tamanna Roshan Lal, MD, about how they are tackling some of the root causes of rare disease trials taking too long and costing too much. But first, the latest news, including a planned library of nature's drugs targeting complex diseases, a paradoxical approach to treating cancer, the discovery of a switch for the desire to exercise, the first ever platform trial in the stroke field, how government policies can help improve equitable access to cancer trials, and the possibility of reversing MS nerve damage. Biotechnology research startup Intrinsic Medicine is creating an entire library of pharmaceutical-grade human milk oligosaccharides, aka HMOs, mimicking the properties of human milk biology to treat what it terms gut immune brain axis disorders, a list that includes Parkinson's and irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, Alzheimer's, and autism spectrum disorder. Data suggests they may be nature's drugs, which, in addition to being as safe as baby formula, can significantly truncate the translation process. Reports company co-founder and CEO Alex Martinez, who practiced law before jumping to entrepreneurship. With its lead compound, Intrinsic Medicine is going straight from the preclinical stage to phase 2 clinical trial, which is about to launch in Australia. The compound is also used for an ongoing investigator-initiated study of pediatric IBD at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. I spoke to him at length, and the resulting story posted recently in Clinical Research News. Check it out. Researchers in the Netherlands will be testing a new combination approach to treating colorectal cancer in a clinical trial that could be underway before the end of the year. The investigative treatment strategy, which performed remarkably well in mice, involves stressing tumor cells with one drug that hyperactivates oncogenic signaling to prime them for elimination by another drug that inhibits the protein responsible for repairing tumor DNA damage. That is in stark contrast to most currently used medications, which inhibit tumor cell division. In a recent study, the novel paradoxical intervention was both highly effective in killing cancer cells and mitigated most of the side effects, most notably problems with therapy resistance. The approach could potentially be used to treat pretty much all cancers. It's a matter of finding the activator oncogenic signaling for the different tumor types. See the show notes for the links for the study that made the cover of Cancer Discovery, as well as a recap of the implications of the findings in an article appearing in Clinical Research News. In Spain, meanwhile, researchers had discovered a switch for the desire to engage in physical activity that points to the possibility of developing drugs for people, notably those struggling with obesity, who need to exercise more but are reluctant to do it. Based on experiments in mice and human subjects, two proteins appear to be activated in the muscle during exercise that control the eagerness to train more in the future. One of the proteins found in lower levels in obese patients activates the area of the brain that controls movement by inducing the production of a third protein known as interleukin-15. Researchers report that their next steps include confirming that IL-15 is a blood marker of the desire to exercise, then learning how different types of exercises stimulate this muscle-brain signaling pathway differently, and in people who are and are not obese, as well as identifying the relationship between exercise, longevity, and cancer, and the mechanisms that regulate it. The study, newly out in Science Advances, is a fascinating read on a topic of potentially huge clinical relevance. And of course, you can find a link to it in the show notes. A national team of researchers are conducting the first ever platform trial in the stroke field, seeking to optimize and improve the care of individual patients. Known as the StrokeNet Thrombectomy Endovascular Platform, or STEP trial, it represents opportunities to test new therapies for stroke faster so patients can get them sooner if they work. The beauty of platform trials is that the patients can be randomized to answer multiple questions simultaneously, and active therapies get offered more often because patients in the control group are being shared. They're designed without a maximum number of patients to enroll and could continue indefinitely with sufficient funding or as more questions are added. Early trial arms will test whether endovascular therapy is beneficial for patients with strokes of milder severity and conduct multi-omic analysis of blood samples to inform the design of new trial questions for specific subsets of patients with similar biomarkers. See the show notes once again for a link to the press release about this from the University of Cincinnati. One of the first pieces of evidence that federal and state policy interventions can improve equitable access to cancer clinical trials has emerged from a new study finding noteworthy progress in states mandating that Medicaid cover the routine costs of clinical trial participation before such coverage became a federal mandate per the Clinical Treatment Act of 2020. The dozen or so states that had independently enacted a coverage policy during the 2012 to 2019 study period saw about a 5 percentage point increase in Black or Hispanic patient enrollment in oncology clinical trials, but none of the other states where the ACA had expanded Medicaid eligibility to millions of people. This suggests that the federal mandate, which went into effect in 2022, could have a meaningful impact on equity and study participation, provided, the study authors say, states collaborate with frontline clinicians to ensure they are aware of the policy change and that those who disproportionately treat patients from minoritized communities are plugged into the relevant trial networks. I'll link to their study and a story I wrote for Clinical Research News about the implications in the show notes. And finally, scientists at the University of California, San Francisco, and Continuum Therapeutics are hopeful that an investigational drug now in phase 2 trials could reverse the nerve damage caused by multiple sclerosis. The first-in-class therapy uses a toxin found in green mamba snake venom that seems to spur the body to replace lost myelin. In a new study, researchers demonstrate how the snake venom toxin illuminates the right target to optimize its curative potential. In the show notes, you'll find a link to the study published in the prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It is now time for a Q&A with Doctors Marshall Summar and Tamanna Roshan Lal about Uncommon Cure's fresh take on how to conduct rare disease clinical trials. Welcome to the show, Marshall and Tam.
Deb, thanks so much for having us on today.
Thank you so much, Deb. It's great to be on the show.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Marshall, when I interviewed you a few months ago for a story that was published in Clinical Research News, you told me about how much you underestimated the vast demand for a new operational model for rare disease clinical trials. Since you've been working in the rare disease field for more than 4 decades and probably seen all the problems firsthand, how was it that you were so caught off guard by the level of market interest?
Well, that's actually a great question, Deb. One of the things you come into something like this is everyone's been using the same system for a very, very long time. And you sort of make the assumption that when you bring something new to the table, it might take a little bit longer for folks to notice or folks to want to change and adapt. And that's kind of where we underestimated. Actually coming in with a new model for doing rare disease clinical trials actually caught hold very quickly. I think we've talked to over 60 companies so far and growing almost on a daily basis, 3 new ones this week. Wow. What we're finding is there's a real driving need for a number of reasons, I think. One is people want to get these therapies to the rare disease patients as quickly as possible. The patients want that. The sponsors want that, and really even the regulatory agencies and everyone else. 2, a lot of the companies that are doing rare disease trials are either in their startup phase or they're kind of in that middle young phase, and so they have to pay attention to runway. And if you can shorten a trial significantly, that extends your runway. The old time equals money is really true for them. So I think there's a lot of attraction from that too. And I know, Tam, you've talked to a lot of these folks and their CMOs and folks. What are you hearing?
We're hearing the same thing. We're hearing about how there's a need to do it quicker and faster and without all the red tape that comes with it. So you're absolutely right, Marshall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so let's get to the nuts and bolts of what Uncommon Cures is doing differently in contrast to the classic contract research organization or CRO model that most listeners should be quite familiar with. What would each of you point to as the key unique features of the approach that is attracting so much attention?
All right, well, I'll kick it off.
Okay.
What we call ourselves as a clinical research program. And what does that mean? Well, what we've done is we've condensed both the regulatory aspects of this with the actual physical administration and conduction of the trial. So, your classic model is you have a CRO that sort of sits outside the medical system. They have to go and find sites, contract with them. So you really have, several stages in there that we've tried to eliminate. We have regulatory folks who work closely with FDA, and then we also recruit, administer to the patients, do the follow-up, collect the data, the whole thing. So by condensing it down to that one point, that actually gives you a tremendous head start from a time saving, if nothing else. For one thing, you've only got one contract, one ethical or institutional review board document. Tam, what about you?
Well, I think the one thing that we do very differently is that we are blending our regulatory experience with hands-on operational execution, something that you don't typically get. And as Marshall says, this is how we eliminate the inefficiencies and we speed up the trial process. Also, we control the cost. And one of the biggest things that we do is that we are trying to make our studies more patient-centric, something that has been lost along the way of in the world of conducting clinical trials. So I'd like to think that we were defining it by blending it with compassion and a hands-on approach at a dedicated research site.
Okay.
It's interesting too. We're seeing that when we're kind of doing our budget work on these and even leaving a nice margin so that, we stay in business, we're still coming in substantially below what the sort of current market is asking for doing these trials. And that's actually been very surprising.
Yeah, given all of the hand-holding going on for sure, which usually means greater cost normally, but you're saying it's just the opposite in this case.
Right, exactly. I think,
Mhm.
we're seeing maybe 50% cost reduction over what you would typically see with a classic CRO and site model.
Yeah, yeah. And as I recall, you're primarily tackling holdups related to the study protocol. Tam, in what ways would you say study protocols have up to now been sort of out of touch with the realities of patients and investigators that you're taking on?
So the traditional protocols have always prioritized the scientific rigor behind them. And, that is absolutely essential. But sometimes this focus really creates a disconnect from the real world experience of the patients and investigators. So, they just don't really align with what people actually need to go through with the clinical trial. One of the biggest challenges that we have seen, and Marshall, I think you agree with me on this, is the frequency of the site visits. The fact that we expect patients with rare diseases and complex diseases to travel long distances multiple times, financially exhausting for the family, emotionally exhausting, and that can be tricky. And then one of the other biggest things is that traditional protocols are extremely rigid, and there's very, very little wiggle room for adjustments. So, we would like to think that we are doing things differently with a more adaptive style of creating protocols. And then, of course, one of the other things is that we see the exclusion criteria as being really, really strict, again, because of data gathering and wanting to maintain the integrity of, the data that's been gathered. But this, again, doesn't really help because it doesn't represent the real world patients that we have in the rare disease world because they are very different, even though they have the same disease. So that's typically what, we've seen with the traditional protocols, if you like.
Mhm.
Yeah, and one of the things, there's actually a couple of good studies out there, Deb, that looked at why do clinical trials fail. Interestingly enough, kind of the same reasons for both rare orphan trials and more mainstream ones. And you'd think it'd be the science, but that's only about 20% of the failures. Actually, two studies, one got 55, the other got 57%. So basically the same answer. It's recruitment and retention.
Mm.
And this is particularly true in orphan diseases. These are high care burden diseases. You've got to take that into account when you're designing your study. And there's always a drive to collect as much data as you can during a study. The problem is if you have a family that's already dealing with a complex clinical situation, let's say too that it's a single parent household, they just may not have the resources or the bandwidth to actually participate in studies. So you have to take that into account when you're designing.
Yeah, yeah. It all sounds so logical, right?
It does. Common sense.
Yeah. And I know a minute ago you were talking about the contract negotiation process and how laborious it can be and shortage of available specialists, of course, to do rare disease studies. And I think all of that is sort of the backstory, Marshall, correct, on how you sort of came to advocate for this totally new approach.
It is.
Well, tell me the story here.
Well, the story actually, it sort of makes sense. So I started back in the 1980s in rare disease and medical genetics, and then watched the field evolve. It went from having just a handful of therapies to now over 1,000 FDA approved treatments for orphan disease. I watched the diagnostic ability go up. And actually, what I saw emerge was rare disease as a unique field of medicine. It's kind of got its own rules because of the numbers of patients, the numbers of diseases. There's no other field like it. We have over 12,000 conditions identified now.
It's crazy.
And it grows by maybe 5 to 10 a week, new ones being identified. And so very informatics dependent, not like your classic field of medicine where the practitioner is expected to be an expert in all diseases. So in many ways, the why now is the time, whereas before the field was still growing, still maturing, still developing. And I think there was also kind of the need to have a certain level of experience in watching these things happen. I was fortunate to be a strong part of the Clinical Research Center at Vanderbilt University, and then also directed the Clinical Research Center at Children's National for a while. So I got a firsthand view of running clinical trials in really good institutions. But what I saw were a lot of those lags. Let's take the contracting, for instance. If you're a university lawyer, your mission is not actually to go out and find new business. Your mission is actually to protect the university. So it's going to create a very different flavor for negotiations than a company like ours, where we want to do the business. So we are going to try to make these things work. So it was accumulating that. It was realizing that the trials were taking too long. And also another thing we'd noticed, and Andrew Lowe, who's on my board, but also is a senior economist at MIT, in our discussions, we had noticed that there was a decrease in investment in orphan and rare disease trials. And we looked at why is that? Well, as long as the returns were as high as they were for a long time, people were willing to put up with the delays and all of the snags that you get when you try to do these using the old model, or sort of the legacy model. But when the payer started pushing back on the pricing, that actually changed the equation so that it became a little less favorable. So what we're looking at and what we think we're going to be able to achieve is actually, let's change the middle of the equation. Let's shorten the time up. Let's improve the chances of success by getting better design, more patient-centric recruitment. And that actually changes that equation back into a more favorable one for the investors on the front end. Because what I did not want to see happen was that continuing to drop off. So I think I just needed 40 years to get the experience. Maybe I'm a slow learner.
I doubt that's the case. We'll go with that. Okay, so you got a great idea. Now you want to expand this great idea. I know the company has some rather ambitious expansion plans, and I don't want to try to tell the tale. So I'm hoping you can tell us something about these new bricks and mortar sites that are planned, where they're going to be, when they're going to open, and how they'll differ maybe in how they walk through the clinical study process with investigators.
Well, Tam, why don't you tell them about the DC facilities, and then I'll tell her about the internationals. How's that?
Sounds good. So our DC facility, or rather Chevy Chase facility, is a state-of-the-art facility. It's beautiful. We have rooms for families where we will be doing consenting. We have rooms for delivering investigational product. We also have infusion rooms, and we will also have rooms that have negative pressure, allowing us to do vital trials that involve gene therapy. And then I think the one that I am most excited about is the pharmacy, because it's state of the art. I can't wait for you to see it, Deb, if you ever come up to our site. But it is state of the art. It allows us to handle, hazardous, non-hazardous, and mRNA, DNA, anything that is currently coming up. We have the potential of delivering drugs anywhere from orals all the way up to gene therapy through intrathecal. So that's through the spine. But I think one thing that we've also done very differently is that we have created a special space for families as well as the children or patients. They actually have rooms where parents can work, so they don't take time off from work, which is a burden on them. Absolutely. Special spaces where they can sit down and relax and charge their technology, but also interact with others. So it's a home away from home, really.
Wow.
Yeah, we even built in space. So a lot of our patients will have either some behavioral issues or autistic type issues. So we even built a quiet room for them. So when it gets to be a bit much, we've got a place where the children or the adult patients can go and just, settle down and be ready to go. Yeah. Well, I'll talk a little bit about our international. So what we wanted to do was come up with locations in pivotal parts of the world. And we actually have made a lot of progress since we last talked. So we have got our entity going in Santiago, Chile.
Wow.
And why Santiago? It's a great economy down there. They are already used to doing medical tourism for Latin America. They have an excellent medical infrastructure.
Hmm.
So it's a really great place to reach out to the rest of the Latin American area. It's easy to get to from both Central America as well as South America. Easy being relative in South America because the distances can be quite far.
Right.
Our other two programs, we've got the one in the United Arab Emirates. So we actually have a great relationship there with the Ministry of Health. They were very eager to become kind of a leader in that region in the Middle East for rare disease clinical trials. They built a lot of infrastructure during COVID, and they wanted to make good use of that. So we're finishing up our agreement with them, but that's going very, very well. But we'll be bringing a lot of patients in through there from that region. And then the other one we're looking at, and we're not looking at actually, we're negotiating the contract even as we speak, is in Zurich. And there we're going to work with the Kinderspital. So rather than building new space in Zurich, which as you can imagine in Switzerland would be a long and probably costly process, there's a fabulous program there at the Children's Hospital. They have a focus on rare diseases. I've been involved with them for the last 20 years around different rare disease issues. And so we want to make use of those world-class facilities. They've opened up their new hospital this summer, their new research program. They have, clinical trial rooms. So, but they were very interested in partnering with us to become a hub around rare disease. So that will come basically, branding through us, but working there with the Children's Hospital. So those three, and then future plans, we'll be looking at Singapore, and just different areas in the world and looking to see what makes sense at the time.
Well, you're going to be earning some frequent flyer miles. It sounds like you're doing
Already
a lot of
have.
travel.
Already have.
I bet you have. Okay, this is interesting. Okay, before we wrap up, I was hoping that you could each take a turn painting a picture of what this fully operationalized rare disease clinical trial paradigm will look like in, I don't know, another 2 years from now or something. Tam, would you like to go first on this one?
Absolutely. I had to ponder on this question. I foresee us not just leading the way in the world of rare disease clinical trials, but actually transforming it into something that's really personal and compassionate, committing a journey for parents and families and children and loved ones where the experience is not just about data and outcomes, but about, real people. We want I would like for us to continue to build deep partnerships with patient advocacy groups and therefore creating this journey for these families, essentially giving families hope that, saying that, hey, this clinical trial ecosystem that we have out there, it's inclusive, it's faster, it's quicker, and we're going to walk through with you every step of the way. That's how I envision it 2 years from now.
Wow. Marshall?
So how would I measure success? I would say if we do this properly, I think there's a potential we see twice the number of rare disease clinical trials coming through the process through the FDA.
Wow.
If we can lower the risk, we can speed up the process. The cost changes because it's a shorter time and all the other things that kind of go along with that. Then the incentives really become a lot more attractive for people to invest in rare disease clinical trials, to see these through. And obviously there's a lot of patient-driven work as well too. I want those families and those family organizations to have a clear pathway. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to build that pathway. And we're working with a lot of patient organizations, and we'll give them advice on where to start and things like that. So we've got a lot of buy-in in the game, since we're actually all clinical clinicians who've taken care of these kids. The other thing I would say would be a success marker is if we see the other companies that are trying to do rare disease clinical trials start to change how they do them and actually start to try to be more efficient. There just hasn't been any market pressure to force that before now. I'm kind of hoping we provide some of that pressure.
Wow. Well, the entire clinical trial enterprise could surely use more change agents. And no one can say that the two of you aren't doing your part when it comes to studies for rare diseases. Thanks for sharing your passion for making a difference for patients who are oftentimes short on advocates. And thanks for taking the time to be on the show today. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be following the progress you're making in the months ahead.
Yeah, thanks. We're happy to come back anytime. You've had a great show.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Okay, as always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. If you're not subscribed to this podcast yet, please consider going to Apple Podcasts and doing so right now so you don't miss your monthly dose of news and perspectives you'll be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. And if you're up for it, I'd be oh so grateful if you'd leave a rating and review while you're there. One more thing before we go. If you liked today's conversation, it is only a glimpse of what you can expect from Scope Europe presenters and panelists. Please plan to join us October 29th and 30th in Barcelona, Spain, when clinical operations executives will be sharing best practices and discussing optimizing digital and hybrid trials in Europe and across the globe. Save an additional 10% off any current rate by using the code SOT10. For more information, visit scopesummiteurope.com. Bye for now.